History as it happens, May 5th, 2022. To end a war.
Our terms to Italy are still the same as our terms to Germany and Japan. Unconditional surrender. We shall not settle for less than total victory.
General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations.
General Douglas MacArthur, in his new role as Allied Supreme Commander for the control of Japan.
I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan.
The Allies demanded and achieved the unconditional surrender of the Axis after conquering their armies and incinerating their cities. Such total victories have proven elusive since, as modern wars have dragged on for years of indecisive fighting, almost always ending in a negotiated settlement of one kind or another. Is that the fate awaiting Ukraine? That's next as we report History as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Tonight I want to speak to you of peace in Vietnam and Southeast Asia.
The important thing was not to talk about peace, but to get peace, and to get the right kind of peace. This we have done.
And by common agreement between us and the North Vietnamese, we are today...
Major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
Those missions now belong to Afghans, who are fully responsible for securing their country.
I'm now the fourth United States president to preside over American troop presence in Afghanistan. And that money is a direct investment in defending freedom and democracy itself. Because if you don't stand up to dictators, history has shown us they keep coming. They keep coming.
At the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, FDR and Winston Churchill agreed on several key points for Allied strategy in the year to come. And on the final day of that 10-day conference, Roosevelt announced that he and the British Prime Minister had decided on a policy unprecedented in modern warfare. Germany, Italy, and Japan must offer unconditional surrender. As the historian Ian Kershaw writes, it was the first time a sovereign state had been formally offered no term short of total and unconditional capitulation.
We shall not settle for less than total victory.
2 years later, August 1945, a few months after FDR's death, and days after the U.S. incinerated Hiroshima and Nagasaki with atomic bombs, President Truman read aloud Japan's full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration. World War II was mercifully over.
General Douglas MacArthur has been appointed the Supreme Allied Commander to receive the Japanese surrender. Great Britain, Russia, and China will be represented by high-ranking officers. Meantime, the Allied armed forces have been ordered to suspend offensive action.
The enemy conquered, its armies and navies almost entirely destroyed, its wartime governments eradicated. Unconditional surrender was obtained. How many other wars have ended that way since 1945? So let's think about what's going on in Eastern Europe right now as I speak into this microphone here in early May. May 9th is the date Russia will commemorate the Soviet Union's victory over the Nazis, and the Kremlin is dismissing speculation that Vladimir Putin will use the occasion to declare war on Ukraine and announce a national mobilization of reserve forces. Now, of course, a war has been raging for 2.5 months, but it appears to be heading into an uncertain and prolonged phase concentrated in the eastern Donbass region. Total victory has eluded Russia. It seems neither side will be able to strike a decisive blow to win the war. I mean, how would Ukraine even define winning? By expelling all Russian troops from its territory? How would Russia define victory? The point is, this war, like almost every other war fought, at least in modern times, is going to have to end in a settlement, possibly a dirty deal where Ukraine, depending on Russia's ultimate intentions in the Donbass, cedes those separatist regions to Moscow rather than shed blood over them. Or maybe something else. I really don't know. I mean, what are the alternatives here? One imaginary alternative is for Russia to admit its mistake and withdraw. Another is the U.S. telling Ukraine, sorry, but your fate is no longer worth billions of tax dollars, so get your weapons somewhere else. That is also unlikely to happen. You know, during the Vietnam War, as the warring sides clobbered each other, they engaged in endless negotiations, in public and in secret, drawn out over years until finally in 1973, Nixon announced his dirty deal.
Throughout the years of negotiations, we have insisted on peace with honor. In my addresses to the nation from this room of January 25th and May 8th, I set forth the goals that we considered essential for peace with honor.
After stage managing a draft peace deal that could be announced before Election Day in 1972 to help Nixon's chances, he and Kissinger had a signed agreement to wave around in January 1973. That was when Nixon gave his peace with honor speech you heard there.
A ceasefire, internationally supervised, will begin at 7 p.m. this Saturday, January 27, Washington time. Within 60 days from this Saturday, all Americans held prisoners of war throughout Indochina will be released.
But that agreement was one they knew all along would not bring peace, but instead they hoped for a decent interval before North Vietnam would conquer the South, a long enough charade so that Nixon would not take the blame for losing Saigon.
You also have to realize, Henry, that winning an election is terribly important. It's terribly important this year. But can we have a viable foreign policy if a year from now, 2 years from now, North Vietnam gobbles up South Vietnam?
Thanks to Nixon's taping system, we know that Kissinger responded to the president in that August 1972 conversation about how long South Vietnam might survive after their phony peace with honor, that if we settle it, say, this October, Kissinger said, by January 1974, no one will give a damn. And here they are in late 72 discussing what to do about South Vietnamese intransigence. Saigon did not want to accept that peace deal. It knew to be a sham because the NVA would maintain forces in country.
We can't delay the negotiation, and we can't tell Hanoi that we're having trouble. No, sir. We're going to play it like an accordion. Right. But when you really come down to it, though, I just can't see how Jews got any other choice. God damn it. We've told him we're doing everything we can, and that's going to be it.
Now, let's imagine that at some point in 3 or 6 or 12 months, President Biden decides privately that Ukraine is unable to defeat Russian forces. And it needs to, if not surrender, come to some kind of accommodation with the invader that has caused so much death and destruction in Ukraine. Maybe it won't come to that, but right now I want to know, where the hell are the diplomats? Ron Milam is a Vietnam combat veteran. He teaches history at Texas Tech, and he is the executive director of the Institute for Peace and Conflict. Ron Milam, welcome back, my friend.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here.
Since you just attended the Society for Military History's annual conference in Fort Worth, I'm assuming there was plenty of conversation about what was going on in Eastern Europe right now. So before we dive into some historical subjects, allow me to ask you, as a military historian and a combat veteran, what is your view of Russia's invasion? Why do you think it's failed to achieve, seemingly at this point, any of its major objectives?
I guess the easy answer would be hubris. Russia believed that there would be Ukrainians who would sort of welcome them, that would see this as an opportunity to be part of the old Soviet Union again. That didn't happen. I think it's been a complete shock to the world that the Ukrainian people stood up to the Russians in so many different ways, at the civilian level, at the military level, at the NATO level, at the United States, at least through economic sanctions. I think they've been surprised by the reaction of the world to their invasion. And as a result of that, they have had to put together almost instantaneous decisions that have not always gone well. Actually, the Russian soldiers themselves have found themselves in difficult situations, having to always fight civilians who are not really a military unit and not knowing exactly how to handle that. They've resorted to what a lot of soldiers do in times like that, and that is they get excessive with the brutality. And that has caused pushback by the civilian community. And then add to that the ability for this war to be seen on social media and the world's reaction to it. I think they've been surprised by that, and they've had a lot of casualties. And those casualties are they're being hidden in many ways from the Russian people. Body bags are not coming home. They're being left on the battlefield. It's a terrible situation that Russia finds itself in militarily.
So I did couch my question with the word seemingly because I'm not sure what Russia's war aims actually are. It appeared at first it was going for Kyiv to achieve total victory and decapitate Ukraine's government. Now the fighting is in the eastern Donbass region. The invasion has caused massive destruction, a refugee crisis, thousands of civilian casualties. As you mentioned, civilians are being brutalized. It seems like Russia's army is running into logistical problems that they weren't anticipating but should have. I'm somewhat surprised that a professional army is having this much trouble, but maybe I shouldn't be.
It's a professional army that hasn't been in combat very much, though. When you think about it, they did some things in Syria. They've tried to do some other things around the world, but armies that aren't used to fighting as a unit don't always get it right. And the things that we know about are the things that impact soldiers on the ground, infantry units. And generally speaking, the infantry units are the ones that are supposed to have been rehearsing, so to speak, and they don't appear to have done that very much. And I think their leadership is poor. The logistics is absolutely horrible. Just simple things like food and water and moving units, the transportation of getting units to a particular place, that 40-mile mess that they had in the first 2 weeks of the war, subjecting themselves to drones and everything else. In fact, we were all commenting back here that it's too bad that they didn't have a sufficient amount of drones to take out those tanks when they first moved in, because they were sitting ducks. And then what you had is even small things like civilians with anti-tank weapons being able to come up and take out a tank with a light anti-tank weapon. Pretty impressive. And that, of course, that causes civilians at the very local level to feel really good about themselves. I don't think the Russian soldiers ever expected anything.
So, Ron, as you know, the title of this episode is How to End a War, Total Victory Being an Illusion. And I'm interested to see if you agree or disagree with that premise. Recent history, my knowledge of military history is pretty much confined to the 19th, 20th, and 21st century. And so far, I have any knowledge at all. Is it accurate to say that wars end through negotiations, that outright total victory is, for the most part, an illusion? And if that is what Putin is going for here, he may never get it.
I have a colleague here at Texas Tech that teaches diplomatic history. And he and I always joke that he gets the beginning and the end, and I get the middle. And it's really true. Every war, the failure of talking, the failure of diplomacy is what causes the war to start in the first place. And then we kill each other for however many days, months, years that takes. And then it always ends in a treaty of some kind. And that's how wars happen. And I don't think you can find hardly any times in history that it doesn't work like that.
Because I've been wondering, where are the diplomats today? We need to get to a point to end this war in Ukraine with a settlement. But World War II would be the exception to this. That was total victory with a demand of unconditional surrender. Would you agree with that?
Yes, and it's hard to make simple statements about something like World War I, World War II, which in terms of warfare, those kinds of wars are really an anomaly. Most wars are small and regional. And in fact, all of the wars leading up to World War I were small and regional. And that's why everybody thought that nothing like World War I could ever happen, because all those other wars within Europe were short wars, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, somebody dominated. But, and again, I hate to get simplistic about this, but quite frankly, at least with Europe, there was a bad guy involved here. Hitler was unusual. And so I think that the idea that it had to be total war and total domination, much of that was to make sure that they took him out, because by the second or third year of the war, and even before that, before America gets involved in World War II, we're watching the activities of Hitler, and it appeared to be like warfare had never been seen before.
Ian Kershaw, who's as good an authority as any, writes in his book titled The End, an apt title because it is about the end of World War II. He writes, in the First World War, there had been no Allied demand for unconditional surrender. The formula produced by President Roosevelt at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943 and agreed by British Prime Minister Churchill was the first time that a sovereign state had been formally offered no terms short of total and unconditional capitulation. You touched on it a bit in your last answer, Ron, but why did the Allies decide to go with this novel idea, if you will?
Well, there's a couple of things. For one, Roosevelt knew that the United States had the ability to end the war with the atomic weapon. Now, it hadn't been tested yet, but he knew it was being made. He knew that. And it was planned to be used against Europe. It wasn't planned to be used against Japan at that time. All of the scientists that were putting that together were doing it with the idea it would be used against Hitler. So that's one thing that he had in his back pocket. But I think also there had been enough evidence that it was going to take the kind of ending that required no negotiations whatsoever. But the idea was that this has to happen for the sake of the world as much as anything else, that this madman, in terms of Hitler, had to be taken out. They kept waiting for something, and there were some indications at that time that in the German army, there were some people trying to take Hitler down. I don't remember the exact events in terms of 43, but there was at least some intelligence that indicated that there was enough people in the German army trying to take him down. But it's also about what is your success on the battlefield? We already made it from Africa. We were fighting in Italy at that time, 43. We had a plan to invade Europe. We had the partnership with Russia by that time. It's always about the battlefield. What have you accomplished on the battlefield? Nobody is going to negotiate from a position of weakness. You negotiate from a position of strength.
Some historians have criticized, or not just historians, people at the time thought that the demand for unconditional surrender would prolong the war. Kershaw doesn't buy that explanation. He says it's a flimsy excuse because it really had no effect on the German military strategy or lack of one. But Roosevelt and Churchill were really looking back at how the First World War ended, weren't they? Germany was allowed, so to speak, to make a case that it hadn't really been defeated after World War I. So they didn't want to leave any question the second time around about the fate of Germany.
I think that's a good argument. The way World War I ends in the creation of the Weimar Republic and the defeated Germany, but a defeated Germany with conditions that they had to make that could never be made in terms of paying the reparations and all of those things. I think we learned a lot from the way World War I ended. In fact, I kind of take the position that in 100 years, we'll probably be talking about the World War. Hopefully we won't have a 3. And we'll be talking about the World War, because I think the interwar period is also just a stalemate when we're trying to define, we went through this whole thing with treaties, the naval treaties. And so I think that we did learn a lot and said, let's not repeat this. No question about it.
So since the Second World War, as we've been discussing, total victory has been difficult for not just the United States, but other countries. You can take the U.S. and Korea, the French in Vietnam, the French in Algeria, the U.S. in Vietnam, where you fought in 1970, 1971, the Soviets in Afghanistan, the U.S. in Afghanistan, the U.S. in Iraq. Modern war just seems to go on indecisively without any, decisive finish. Why do you think that is?
I teach the concept of limited war. We use the phrase limited war, and I always like to put it in quotation marks because to a soldier, there is no such thing as a limited war. So that's important for my students to understand. But since World War II, the end of the war being done with atomic weapons, we've entered into a period of always concerned about somebody using some kind of a weapon that's going to destroy the world. So every war that America has fought, certainly through the 70s, or 60s and 70s, was always that concern about World War III. So we didn't want that to happen. So that was a period of time for the 60s and 70s. Since then, we've always established that wars can be successful regionally. And as long as you can keep the neighbors from not getting involved in them, as long as you can keep things sort of under control, you have limited goals. The United States never, for example, with Vietnam, the United States never had its goal complete domination of the country of Vietnam. All we were supposed to do was to keep a democratic government in South Vietnam. We never invaded North Vietnam, which would have been obvious if you were trying to really defeat the North Vietnamese. We would have invaded North Vietnam. Never did that. Never even had our allies plan on invading North Vietnam. Same thing with Korea. You had a stalemate. The only thing was to keep South Korea free. But war aims are the most important part of any kind of war. And if your aim is limited, then that's all you can do. That's all you can get your society to support you in doing. Every single war that has happened, all the wars that you mentioned have always had limited war aims. What do you want when this is all over? And then as the fighting starts, if one side is able to dominate the battlefield, then you might change those war aims, but it hardly ever happens. The war aims are set, you get your job done, and then you go home. You negotiate an end to it. And it's frustrating because that's what soldiers are asked to do, asked to die for in many cases.
Is it possible that the Second World War misled U.S. leaders into believing superior firepower, superior economic might could guarantee victory on the battlefield? Because some of those examples I mentioned, the firepower was one-sided advantage, right? Dealing your opponents, in some of these cases, were peasants. Massive casualties, massive amounts of damage inflicted through air power doesn't translate to victory.
Correct. Vietnam's best example of that. And some of the people that were advising President Johnson were making him aware of that a defeat at the hands of black pajamaed Viet Cong would be the worst thing that could happen to America. But they're fighting on their own ground. And we have decided that we're going to also fight a limited war. I think firepower, air superiority, artillery, all of those things can be discounted if you have a will of the people on the other side. It happened with Vietnam. We're seeing it in the Ukraine right now. If the people are willing to stand up and die for the invasion of another country, and that's what happened with Vietnam, it's what's happened with the Ukraine. When the enemy comes into your country, into your territory, if you have charismatic leaders, if you have people that can explain why this is important to push back on the invader, you have a chance. You don't know whether it's going to be successful until you really get into it, but you certainly have a chance. I mean, you can go all the way back to the war for independence.
That's right.
The invasion was from the outsiders coming into the colonies. I think we underestimate how local people can stand up to any kind of firepower. And that's certainly what's happened in the Ukraine.
And that ended, the Revolutionary War ended in a settlement. Now, of course, the British did suffer a major defeat, but some historians make the argument, and I tend to agree with this, that the British missed their only real chance to win that war in 1776-77 in the Northern Campaign, which means the ensuing years of bloodshed did very little to alter the ultimate outcome. But in the end, it was a treaty signed in 1783, about 2 years after Yorktown.
Yeah. Yes, we can also make the argument that they had a Southern strategy that was pushed back by George Washington putting Nathaniel Greene in charge. It's always interesting to me that when you drive around the South, you see all these towns called Greenville. All those towns are named for Nathaniel Greene because he was able to put together local people, almost a little guerrilla warfare going on with local militias to push back on what the British thought. Because when the British went into the South, they thought they would find British supporters, loyalists down there, and they didn't find that. What they found were people saying, hey, wait a minute, we don't want you in our little town. We don't want you in our little colony. So get the hell out of here. Governments everywhere discount the impact of having an invading force in your backyard. We can see it throughout history. If civilians will push back, and they have to pay a huge price in lives. We're certainly seeing that in the Ukraine, but we saw it in Vietnam all over.
So if the Second World War was an anomaly, in that there were clear and achievable war aims that Allied military and economic superiority would bring about the complete defeat of the Axis powers, and that those governments would not survive the end of the war. There would be no post-war Nazi Germany. The Vietnam War might be the best example of, well, at least for our discussion, a war that was ended by settlement, negotiations that went on for many, many years while both sides clobbered each other. Before we get to the U.S. in Vietnam, the French were in Vietnam. What brought the French to the negotiating table in 1954?
The triggering event, of course, was the success of the Viet Minh against France at Dien Bien Phu. And the interesting thing of that story is that there were negotiations that were almost going on at the exact same time in Geneva. And there were a lot of things on the table in Geneva, but one of the things on the table was not to be French losing the huge battle at Dien Bien Phu. It was about a 2-month battle, but the first week, in fact, the first night at Dien Bien Phu, there were so many French leaders killed by Viet Minh artillery raining in the first 15 minutes of that battle. Shocked the world. The French had set up this garrison in a location that was absolutely terrible. I've been to Dien Bien Phu a couple of times, and it's amazing that you would set your garrison up down in a valley that is surrounded by mountains with triple canopy jungle. And you've got virtually no aerial reconnaissance to see what the enemy is doing. Again, complete hubris. There's no way, of course, they've been fighting for 7 years against Viet Minh, but there was no way that the French garrison was going to be taken out by a bunch of Viet Minh. And they did, they took them out. So right away, it was evident that France was in trouble. France turns to the United States to help. Eisenhower says, no way, we're not going to send anybody in. Sends his own people, sends his own lieutenants in to look at the situation in Vietnam. And Eisenhower decides not to help the French with anything they wanted, including the request for nuclear weapons, small tactical nuclear weapons, discussion that we're having right now with the Ukraine. So Eisenhower says, no way we're going to help the French in that respect. And we don't. Well, we give them a lot of money. And of course, we're supporting the French with our finances.
And so we had been bankrolling.
That was a triggering event.
We had been bankrolling the French war effort for many years, but after or during Dien Bien Phu, as you just said, I mean, that was it, right? At some point, what are the war aims? What can you possibly accomplish here?
Absolutely. And they got no help in Geneva. Now, the thing that happens in Geneva that's really sad, I mean, not taking sides here, Ho Chi Minh and Viet Minh should have been rewarded for their victory over France, but instead they get a divided country, and that's kind of the rest of the story.
Yeah, where the Western powers placed the dividing line at Geneva. These were not treaties, but these were the agreements, if you will, that end the French nightmare in Vietnam. They placed the dividing line farther north than it really should have been, right?
Yeah, at the 17th parallel. And the idea is we're going to divide this country into two pieces, and then we'll have a big election in 2 years, 1956, and let the people decide whether they want an independent Vietnam, a unified Vietnam. And of course, the United States is very insistent on making sure that election doesn't take place, because most people believe, even though there wasn't any Gallup polling back in those days, most people believe that Ho Chi Minh would have won that election. And we put our own guy in there, at least we try to put our own guy in there with No Dinh Diem. And I always teach that Geneva is a success for the United States, quotation marks again, a qualified success in that we got something that we wouldn't have had otherwise. But the Dulles brothers and Eisenhower, in my opinion, kind of made a mistake by allowing that divided country to take place, because they've been fights then a whole war over that issue a few years later.
The war starts picking up again by the late 1950s because, as you mentioned, the U.S. saw to it that there would be no election, which was promised because it was plainly obvious to Eisenhower that Ho Chi Minh, a communist, would have won. So the U.S. then, as we know, gets involved in Vietnam, and negotiations really begin in 1968, right? But there's really no progress until 1972. Did each side make demands that the other simply would not agree to, such as the U.S. insisting that the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, withdraw from South Vietnam, which was eventually what was agreed to? but it took a long time to get there. What's your take on that?
Well, the North Vietnamese are never required to completely pull out of South Vietnam. They leave soldiers in Quang Ngai and Quang Tri province, which is the sticking point for President Thieu. The sad thing about the way that war ends, for South Vietnam at least, there was two negotiators, main negotiators, Henry Kissinger and Le Duc Thuy. And these two guys, outside of the big table and all the people and Averell Harriman and all those people that are supposed to be doing all the negotiation from November of 1968. But the back channel negotiations are going on between Kissinger and Le Duc Thuy. And Le Duc Thuy actually makes his demands that Kissinger sort of agrees to in October, right before the election, right before the U.S. election in November of 72. It doesn't change much by the time we negotiate the end of it in January, February of 73. Not much changes other than that Nixon is reelected. And so it's really sad. I just taught this lecture just the other day to my Vietnam War class. It's really sad to see that not much changed except that thousands of people were killed in the Linebacker 2 bombings and the so-called Christmas bombings to get the people to come to be more serious at the negotiating table. But all negotiations are the same. You try to improve your situation, your strength on the battlefield to get the other side to think, well, I better do something about it right now. But if you look at the settlement terms in October of 1972, a few weeks before the election in November, and the settlement that actually happens in March of 1973, there's not much difference. And like I say, the sad thing is a lot of people died in the meantime, including some Americans. We're about out by that time, but a lot of Vietnamese died as a result of that.
So, Ron, thank you there. You corrected me. I misspoke. Eventually, it's the North Vietnam's insistence that it keep forces in South Vietnam that the U.S. agrees to, concedes to.
And that's the reason that President Thieu of South Vietnam was pushing back so hard. He said, how can I have a country if the enemy is within my borders? That makes no sense. That's what held up the negotiations at the end so much. And Kissinger essentially said, yeah, well, okay. And the deal was, Kissinger says, it's okay if you leave them there. If they move out of their garrison location, we will know that with reconnaissance, and we will bring in the B-52 bombers and take them out. That was what was promised. The only problem with that is President Nixon, who made that promise, is no longer in power when that happens in 1975, and they move out of their garrison and they start moving south down to take over Saigon. So Nixon's gone by that time, and there's nothing that we can do with B-52s. And of course, Ford tries to get it and all that stuff. Anyway.
Yeah, Congress ultimately, I should say, steps in and puts an end to the war as far as U.S. involvement. You're right. Ford tried to bail out the South Vietnamese one last time in 75. You know what's so galling from a historical perspective is when you look back on how cynical Nixon and Kissinger were. Knowing in 1968 that the war was lost, but dragging out the process in what was called Vietnamization. Citing Max Hastings' book here on the Vietnam War, which was titled Vietnam, an Epic Tragedy, 1945 to 1975. He's referencing late 1972, September 1972. You mentioned Le Duc Thuy and Kissinger were engaging in secret negotiations to end the war. Kissinger strikes a deal with Thuy, and he explains it to Nixon in a phone call, talking about creating a commission of national reconciliation where eventually there might be elections to unify the country. You see, Mr. President, Kissinger says, this is all baloney because the practical consequence of our proposal, as of their proposal, is a ceasefire. There'll never be elections. Nixon asks, so then what happens? They just resume the war later? But we'll be gone. Kissinger responds to the president, yeah. This was what they referred to as a decent interval. What was the decent interval?
Yes. And the sad thing about that is Henry Kissinger's decided that the South Vietnamese cannot stand on their own once America leaves. And I think even South Vietnam realizes that's going to be a problem. But the decent interval that America had thought was probably going to happen was probably even General Jacques, even a lot of the leadership, Van Dong, some of the guys in North Vietnam, even they think it will take 5 to 10 years. And it takes 2. It takes 2 years is all.
And those 2 years of combat came at an appalling cost to the North Vietnamese, because before 75, the U.S. was continuing to support the South Vietnamese ground forces with air power, right?
Yes. And some will argue that when America left, we didn't leave a lot of parts. We should have left more. I happen to believe that we let our ally down. And having served with our ally very closely, not in an American unit, as an advisor, I felt it would be very difficult for them to survive America exiting the war. Not because they wouldn't try hard or anything like that. But remember, the North Vietnamese had considerable support from the Soviet Union and considerable support from China. And that didn't go away once America stopped supporting the South Vietnamese. And I don't mean necessarily with troops on the ground, but with SAM missiles, all the things that they had trained their North Vietnamese allies to do stayed in place for those next 2 years. So lacking the support of America, but having the support of China and the Soviet Union on the communist side really helped the North Vietnamese to be successful.
What I suppose is most disgusting about the way Nixon and Kissinger approach this issue of negotiations to end the war is that they eventually settle on the only terms the North Vietnamese really cared about, and that was the U.S. would leave and the NVA would remain in the South, only to have their decent interval, knowing that the North was going to overwhelm the South anyway, happen sometime after the election so it doesn't make Nixon look bad.
Correct. It's a sad, sad thing. Nixon, in 2 different situations, I would argue that in 68, when he's running for president, he has emissaries essentially tell President Thieu that Thieu will be better off waiting until he wins the election to negotiate with, to have Nixon be in charge of the negotiations rather than Hubert Humphrey. That's the first time. That's almost treason. There's a discussion between Nixon and Johnson where Johnson calls Nixon out on it. And Nixon denies that he's doing anything. He lied.
This was the Chenault affair, right?
Yeah. And then in 72, it's the same thing, which is hard to understand in 72 because he's going to beat McGovern no matter what. The polls are all on Nixon's side. And so he does it anyway. And the sad thing about that, again, is that people die when you're playing those kind of politics, whether it's the enemy or whether it's your own people. People are dying at the same time somebody's trying to get elected president of the United States. Very sad situation.
And you mentioned there the leader of South Vietnam at that point, Thieu. Mm-hmm. He hates the deal because he's going to lose his country, such as it was. So he blows it up, right? He leaks news that the Paris peace accords have been agreed to preliminarily. It was a draft agreement. So Nixon launches Linebacker 2 in December of that year, kills lots of people, makes no real impact on the ultimate peace agreement. In the end, a dirty deal was made to end the war. And to link it to what's going on today in Ukraine, Max Hastings himself was on this podcast. He said that a dirty deal is going to have to be made at some point, depending on what the facts on the ground are. We're not quite sure what Russia's ultimate war aims are, if it's just the Donbass now or to go all the way to Kyiv. But to end the war and prevent months, if not years, of a grinding stalemate in eastern Ukraine, he believes a dirty deal is going to have to be done that could potentially mean Ukraine ceding some of its territory to an aggressive power. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do. And most likely Russia will be satisfied if it can completely take over the Donbass region. And they already have Crimea, but that area will probably end up in Russian control. More so than it is now. There's probably going to be a written agreement that Ukraine will never be in NATO, which was the reason that Russia argues it was out there in the first place. The other thing that has happened, though, through this, and I guess we could say this is sort of a good thing, is we do see NATO a little bit stronger than it was before. We do see NATO a little bit more concerned. And I don't know, whether the money is going to continue to flow. They're going to all have to stand up a little bit more with their contributions to NATO, all of the NATO countries. I think Poland is very nervous. And of course, what we keep hearing from Zelensky is that, Poland will be next and that sort of thing.
I don't know about that.
I don't know that that's going to happen because I think Russia has really been spanked on this thing.
And look at all the trouble Russia's having. To talk about Russia planting its flag in Poland seems crazy, but it's only been 2.5 months, and Russia is still enormously powerful militarily relative to the Ukrainians. But I would like to discuss the U.S. role here, and I hardly have to convince a Vietnam veteran about the dangers of mission creep. But are you concerned about the lack of substantive debate about open-ended U.S. military support for Ukraine?
Well, there is no debate. There's no pushback on it. And I think it's sort of like something we didn't have in Vietnam. We had, 2 days later, television news showing what happened in Hue or what happened in Da Nang. But what we've got now is instantaneous everything. And it's pretty hard to be a politician and push back on giving weapons to people when you see refugees on buses in Poland and you see body bags and you see all these things happening. Politically, it's not a good idea to say, well, maybe we should stop. Maybe we shouldn't be helping the Ukrainians fight off this giant Russian military coming into our country. That's not a political, particularly in an election year. That's not something you say, I think I'll be on the other side. On the other side, you appear to be supporting Russia if you say we shouldn't be helping. But the other side of that is that nobody has said we need to put ground troops in. Nobody has said that the United States should be helping with ground troops or even air support, a no-fly zone. We did have a debate about the no-fly zone, that we shouldn't be doing that. There were people suggesting that. So at that level, we have had some debate.
Were you concerned at all when the Pentagon announced what appeared to be a subtle shift in policy or strategy here from defending Ukraine to weakening Russia?
Yeah, a little bit. I think that means that the military intelligence of what's going on in Ukraine it's very possible that there could be significant winning on the battlefield. Our military knows that. Not only does that help the Ukraine in this current battle, but it helps all the other concerns on NATO allies that Russia may take it out on them, so to speak. So weakening Russia is a good thing, and we're willing to talk about it. But it is significant.
We're just days away as we're discussing this here, Ron, from Vladimir Putin, May 9th, the anniversary of the Soviet victory over the Nazis, officially declaring war on Ukraine. Now, of course, a war is already underway, but that tells me it's possible we're going to see more escalation. My final thoughts, what are yours?
I think so. And I don't know exactly what that means for them to declare war. I've seen that said. I know what it means in America if we declare war, and we haven't done it since World War II. But I think it's supposed to mean we're ready to really take this thing more seriously than we are. But you still got soldiers on the ground that aren't getting it done. And so that means you maybe put the air war. You talked about air superiority. Maybe they start doing that. But the scary thing is they're going to keep saying this idea of tactical nukes or chemical weapons. And is that a red line? Yeah, I think we've said that it is a red line. But how do we respond to that if it does happen? That's a little bit frightening. Yes.
Ron Milam of Texas Tech, we thank you for your insights. On the next episode of History as It Happens, in Chinese history, there are plenty of examples of lunatic government campaigns trying to force compliance on the population. On that note, we're going to examine what China is trying to do with COVID right now. COVID zero? Are you kidding me? That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.